Good everyone. I hope you're having an amazing day. So today I'm gonna covering more information about exceptions. Right? We talked about two exceptions last time, so we're gonna talk about more today. So the first thing first, right? You need to register for an org if you haven't done so. So I've logged into my org. So let's jump into Developer Console. So to go to Developer Console, go to the gear cog icon and Developer Console here. Okay. So it will take you to the Developer Console. So in the last episode, I talked about DML exception type and the list exception type, right? So if you haven't watched that episode, I would highly encourage you to do so. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna talk about a null pointer exception. So at times, you remember, right? You know, in Apex, right? When you declare a variable, right, it has to be assigned a value before you start using it. Okay. Otherwise, when you just declare a variable, it will be a null. Okay. So when you try to use a null variable, it will throw a null exception. Okay. So let me show you what I mean by that. So as usual, so you put your code inside the try catch. So we're gonna do. So we're gonna say integer a. Okay. And so let me put the catch block here first. Okay. And we say null pointer exception. And then we have ex, that's the name of the variable. System dot, you can say system dot debug, and we can say ex dot get message, right? So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to do system dot debug. Okay. So I will multiply this with say 1, right? A times 1. So a is an integer. So now what will happen is it will throw an exception because you have declared a variable here of a data type integer, but you haven't assigned any value to it, right? So in Apex by default, a variable has a null value if you don't assign any value to it. Okay, so let me run it and show you what happens. Sorry, just have to be with close this bracket. Right. So attempts to dereference a null object. Okay, pretty straightforward, right? Now, a second. If I assign this to say 1, okay, so it will not throw an exception because you have initialized the value of an a with the value of 1, right? So the a contains a value. It has a memory now, right? You're not assigning and you're not working with a null variable, okay? In this case, you are working with a variable a which has a value of 1, okay? So that's simple, right? So as usual, so I declare a variable of integer a, okay? And then if I don't assign any value, say in this case I've assigned the value of 1, okay, if I do not assign any value to a will contain a null value, okay. So you cannot perform any sort of operation on a null value, okay. It means you can't do addition, you can't do subtraction, you can't do multiplication, you can't do division, you can't do anything to do with any kind of operation you can't do with that variable because it's null. Okay, so in this case, right, we won't get any null exception. Okay, right. So right, so you get the value 1. The reason why you got the value 1 because 1 times 1 is 1, right? So that's why you got the value here. Okay. Now another exception type I wanted to talk about is a query exception, which is very common. So what happens is that in using Apex, right, you can query your Salesforce objects, right? You can query an account object, or you can query a contact object. You can query any custom object you create, right? They are all part of S object, right? So any record, right, a in a Salesforce is a type of S object. Okay, so what happens is at times you try to query something. Okay, let's say I would like to query select ID from an account when name equals to say Peter, right? Say for whatever reason, right, there is no such name called Peter, right? It should return something back saying, look, it do not, there's no such thing called Peter, right? So that's exactly what we're going to do today. We will use a specific query exception type to capture the queries. Okay, so what we're going to do, so we will, so I hope you guys know how to write a SOCL in Apex. If not, I'll cover that. Don't worry. So first thing first, right? As you know that you need to declare a variable. Okay, so in this case, it's an account. The data it's an S object type, right? So account. So you can put a as a variable. Please put meaningful name. So you can put ACC or whatever, right? But just don't put like Johnny's account or Peter's account or Trump's account. Right. So if you wanted to use a SOCL query in an Apex, you have to enclose it between brackets, square brackets, right? So you do select. Okay, it's like writing a SQL query inside a code, right? Inside your Apex code. That's exactly this in simple terms. Select ID from the same way you write SQL query in a dev console, right? So the same query you need to write it here in a similar way. So from account, say where name equals to say 94, right? So today's in a robotic age, you might hear an account called XTXYZ, like Elon Musk named his kid, right? Something to do with T60, whatever the name is. The name of the specific name is, I don't recall, but just saying. Okay, so in this case, right now I'm going to replace this exception type to query exception. Okay, so what will happen, right? When you run this code, right, it will fire an exception. Now, the reason why it will fire an exception is, so this one, right, this line of a code, like select ID from account, it will not return anything, right? It will not return a record back. So that means you're trying to assign a null value to this A, okay? And that will fail, okay? So I'll repeat it again. So the select ID from account, right, where name equals to 94 will return no value whatsoever, right? So you're trying to assign something which do not exist to A, so it will throw out an exception. Okay, let's check it out. Okay, list has no rows for assignment to an S object. Okay, now let me go and change something here. Let's say I will limit, I don't care, any account. Okay, so what I'm doing here, I'm asking Salesforce using so-called that, please give me an account, any account. I don't give a damn. Give me any freaking account, right? So I'm limiting by number one. Okay, so it will give me a single account record, right? I don't know which one. It will pick it up something and return, right? In this case, right, it will not throw any exception whatsoever. Okay, so let me show you this. So okay, so absolutely not, right? There is one more exception type, which is a normal exception, which is a common exception type, which will capture it, you know. So you don't have to say where name equals to, okay? This is a common exception type. See, it returns the same message, right? So you don't have to. So the thing is, and this exception type is very handy. So this exception type, okay, is very handy because it is a common exception type. Okay, now let me run what's it called? A null pointer one. Okay, what we did before, integer a. Okay, now we say system.debug a type 1. Okay, now let me run this. Okay, attempt to reference a null object, right? Right, now let me go back and do this as query exception. Right. See, the thing is, it's exception. Normal exception will capture any exception, right? It doesn't matter if it's a query or it's a list exception. So let me do a list exception. I use exception uh, for most of the thing. Uh, so case by case, but exception ex is the most commonly used. Okay, so let me do something with the list. Okay, so I'll just list, which we did yesterday or day before yesterday, whenever it is. Come on, integer. Okay, um, a equals to new. Okay. Um, hang on a second. There's just a second. Okay, that's great. Now, just do a. Let's do one. All right. See, list index out of bounds, right? So what I was trying to do here, I was trying to assign I was trying to access a value, right? At zeroth position. Okay, I was trying to assign a value to the list of zeroth position, but there's none. The list is empty, right? So that's why you got a message list index out of bounds. So you don't have to write list exception here. So I use exception most of the times, right? This will work. This will capture pretty much everything. Okay. You can customize your own exception if you want. You can create a separate class to extend the exception, and there are different methods here. Okay, which is very handy. I will show you. Which you should use, which I love to use this one. So I'll show you why. So 4, okay. So what does that mean? Oh, come on. That the exception happens at the line number 4. So this method is very handy, right? Because I use this all the time. Because imagine you have 1,000 lines of code, right? And it's not enough that when you get a message called list index out of bounds, right? Imagine you have 50 lists in a code, right? So which one, right? You won't know. So till you put the line number, right? Line number will exactly point to which line of the code it's failing, okay? Or you can use a debugger, integrated debugger using Visual Studio. But it's always good to know, right? Which line the code is failing. So I use get line number. I mean, this is very handy. Okay, and there's other method called get cause, and there's I think there's something. There are a lot of it here. So ex dot get cause, I guess something like that. Yeah, get cause. So you will have, so it's null. Okay, so I mean, I would encourage you to read the documentation around this exception type, right? Ex and different methods. It's very handy. I mean, I will like to give that as a homework or assignment for you to figure out, right? Please read out the documentation. Apex has a very good documentation. I will put the link in the description below for information, right? So this is very important. So this is how you normally do exception. The reason why I talked about other exception, not to confuse you guys, but to give you understanding about we have different types of exception, right? Different kinds of exceptions that can happen, right? In an Apex, right? So you have to understand that, right? So now think about a scenario, right? In this case, I wanted to execute a line of a code. Okay, so let's say just a dummy case, done, right? So what I want, so now I want this line of a code to be executed system.debug, no matter if the exception happens or not. Okay. So my requirement is I want this piece of a code to be executed to, but we have a problem here, right? So if you remember from my previous episode, if there's an exception at the line number 4, it will not run system.debug. It will straight away jump to exception block, right? And so it will skip the piece of a code, right? So that's not very handy. That's not very productive. That's not really great, right? So do we have a solution? Yes, we do. There is a keyword called finally, which we can use here. So we put something like finally. Okay. So we remove the code, take this code from here. Okay. So finally, what does finally means, right? It means that it doesn't matter if your code breaks or if your code dies, right? It will run finally piece irrespective of it, right? If there are 50 exceptions, doesn't matter. The final piece of a code will get executed, right? I mean, if it's under try finally, right? So you can put try, catch, and finally all in the same line. It's fantastic, right? So the finally is always used if you wanted to make sure a piece of a code should run irrespective of the exception, okay? So in this case, let me show you what happened. So let me remove this, okay? And I will say debug. See, done. So we had an exception at line number 4. Okay, so let me walk you through the code again to make it more clear for you. So when a compiler run, right, when this piece of a code run, what happens? The code it runs try first, then this bracket, then it runs this piece of a code list here. Okay, right? Then it try to execute line number 4. Then it says, oh, there's an exception. So the code straight away jumped to line number 12. Okay, so it will run this line number 12, then it run the line number 13. Okay, after that it will straight away jump to um, the finally block. Okay, and it will run it. Okay, so finally is an important block. Okay, so you need to understand one thing, right? You should use finally if you wanted to make sure that a piece of a code should get executed, right, irrespective of exception or not. Right, so that's where the finally comes in the picture. Okay. So we covered today very important stuff. Okay, we covered about exceptions. We talked about null pointer. We talked about query exception. Right. We talked about a general exception. Right, which is the one I recommend you guys to use it. But what I really suggest you guys to please read the documentation. Right, it's very important. You guys read the documentation. So most of the time, I mean, pretty much every time, the exception. This is a generic exception, right? It will capture pretty much every exception type, okay? So this is very important. And please read the method, that's get message. Get message is something which you will, which is used to display the error message, and the get line number is to display the line number at which the exception happened, right? So we talked about the final section. So this is pretty much about the error handling in general in Apex, right? You see, it's very important. Error handling, I can't emphasize enough, right? How important the error handling is, right? If I see a code, right, without try block, try catch, or try catch at least, right? And if you're trying to do a complex operation that involves, insert, update, or getting a data from, Salesforce objects, right, using SOCL. And if there is no try catch, I will straight away say, look, your code has failed the review, okay? Because there is no try catch. That's a bad piece of code, right? I do not like to see such kind of code. I mean, I'll be very honest. I do not let that code to pass the code review. That's simple as that. Because you are introducing potential bugs, right? You can't assume that your code will work. The data can go wrong for whatever reason, right? So when the data can get wrong, you know that even if you're a functional consultant, right, you would have done the data migration, right? So you do know, right, that things will never get right, in the first try, okay? You might have to repeat again and again. Sometimes, there must be a duplicate data. Sometimes there will be faulty data in an Excel, right? So the same way, right? You can't assume that code will be perfect every single time. So yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about today. So yeah, I hope you have an amazing day. Greetings and adios. Take care.